Welcome to the Real Talk with Megan podcast, where we have candid conversations about the things that matter most. I'm your host, Megan, and we're going to deep dive into the topic of mental health. Together, we'll work to destigmatize mental health and start conversations. So sit back, grab a cup of coffee, and get ready for a real and raw conversation about mental health on the Real Talk with Megan podcast. Today, we're back. Joni is back with us. I always love it when Joni's here. We have great conversations, and the conversations start way before we ever start recording this. And then I'm like, oh, we should have pushed record and then keep going. So I love it. And hopefully we've got a lot of great information today. I'm excited about this topic. So thank you for being here.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And we're going to talk about intentional grief. And we decided that's what we're calling it. But essentially grief. So explain a little bit what grief is.
Grief is it's the expression of our hearts whenever we've experienced any type of loss. So you can put anything in there.
Yeah.
It does not have to be the death of a person, right? It could be the loss of a job, the loss of that movie that we have playing in our head about what our future is going to look like.
Yeah.
So say we made a decision or someone else made a decision that affected that future.
Yeah.
We grieve the loss of that. Pets, homes, so many things.
There's so much. Yeah. And it's interesting that we think of grief as like, well, this happens, then this happens, but like it hits everybody so differently. And we don't think of all the other pieces or like the grief that we have happen while we're living, like while things are going on. So what are some of those different examples maybe you can kind of think of?
Well, I think that the thing that comes around the most when I find myself sitting across from someone is this expectation that it should be over. And, I should be over it by now, or I should be better by now, or this shouldn't make me spontaneously combust.
Yeah.
I should be better. And so we start diving into the shoulds. Like, where did you get the idea? Like, tell me why you should. Where did you learn that? And I think so much comes from our culture that tells us that you have 3 days to grieve the death of a spouse or something, like 2 days for a parent, and like so many days if you lose a child. That's how many days you have to grieve. Then you need to get right back at it.
Right.
And while, yes, there is a time to move forward, but I think what we hear is you should be over it.
Right.
And so we should just get back to life as normal and just move on. And there's so many messages that we hear that are just wrong. And then they just cause us a lot of deep pain, unnecessary deep pain then.
And in reality, do we ever actually get over it?
Nope.
No.
Like you can't. Well, one thing that is really, I think, really important to differentiate is between moving forward, getting over, and forgetting. Like, a lot of people think that if I move forward, then that proves that I didn't really love them that much. Right? If I'm gonna, quote unquote, get on with life, then it's gonna look like, or I'm even gonna think that about myself. Well, I obviously didn't love them that much if I can go on and do these things, right? And the idea that if I get over it, it means I'm going to forget them.
Yeah.
And it's a real fear.
Yeah.
But in all honesty, unless there was something medical that happened, or like, you're not going to forget them. Like, you just can't forget them.
They're part of you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that goes with different situations too. And I can think of scenarios where I've talked to different people who, like, their kid has some kind of disability. And so that's a grief process, a whole different level that we don't think about, that you have to grieve the loss of a child you thought you were going to have, and that your child is different. That doesn't mean that's anything bad or something's wrong. It just, there's a different normal. And so I think I had heard a line that about intentional grief, and it creates a new normal.
Yes.
And I loved that because it's like, what is normal? I don't know that anybody really knows that, but we can come out of a time of grief, and if you really process it and go through it, you can create this new normal that can be a fulfilling life.
Sure. And there's, the difference between ongoing grief, like
Mm-hmm.
you talk about, if say child was born with some type of special ability,
Mm-hmm.
and you're gonna come across different situations
Yeah.
where you're like, oh wait, we can't do those situations,
Mm-hmm.
so I'm gonna grieve that. And then there'll be another situation, oh, I'm gonna grieve that. So there's just this, it's
Yeah.
just ongoing that we're gonna grieve these different situations. Or again, like I find myself like revisiting, maybe, oh, if I had made that decision, I would be here by now, or I'd be
Yeah.
doing this by now. And so, oh, there's a grief process there,
Yeah.
which is very different than having an actual date of
Right.
loss,
Yeah.
right? And being able to begin to accept
Mm-hmm.
that I don't have it revisiting over and over and over
Yeah.
again. Yeah.
Yeah. And we have like, everybody's heard the stages of grief. You
Hmm.
have denial. I'm trying to get them in order. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance.
Hmm.
And we like to put those in a linear
Hmm.
time frame.
Hmm.
Like,
Hmm.
well, I'm going to go through this, and then
And
I'm going
then
to
I'm gonna
go
do that.
through, I'm going to bargain, and then
Hmm.
but like that's not the way
Nope.
it
Not at all.
works.
Not at all.
And so when we can start to wrap our mind around the idea that it's not linear,
Nope.
that there's ebbs and flows, and that even when you get to acceptance, there's situations that come up that are going to bring those feelings back.
Hmm.
And if we can get to a place where we recognize that, that can help your healing process so much more.
Yeah. And I think probably a better word is like the feelings of grief. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? Like the experiences of grief.
Mm-hmm.
It's not really stages, because we think that you're
Yeah.
going to go from one to the next and then you're not going to have to go back to one again.
Right.
Nope. You can go to 1 to 3 to 2 to 5 to back to 2. Yeah. It's a storm. It's not really a line at all. A big piece that I hear, and we talked about this right before we got on, and the quote that you said about it happening to us, what was that?
We look at grieving as something that is happening to us instead of something we are actively doing.
Yes. And then we both chuckled because we were like, grieving is an action word, right? It's a
Absolutely.
verb, and both of us were like,
Yeah.
absolutely, it's something you do.
Yeah.
It's just not something you endure,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Mhm.
and that's why we came up with the word intentional grief.
Yep.
Is because we really do have to be intentional with it,
Mm-hmm.
and not just think that it's going to happen to us, and then we're just going to like ride it out, ride the
Right.
waves, and then at some point it's just done.
Yeah.
No, like we have to honestly be intentional about it. And kind of what that looks like is, I set aside time to allow myself to think about whatever it was that I
Yep.
lost. I allow myself to cry.
Mm-hmm.
I allow myself to weep.
Yeah.
That means I get somewhere where I can weep and wail, um, and just let it all out. We don't like to do that.
No.
Um, I think a lot of the reason why, again, informed by our culture,
Mhm.
is the message that we're not supposed to be uncomfortable,
Yeah.
that being uncomfortable is bad. And this actually is the opposite. It's
Yeah.
saying, I am actually going to make myself uncomfortable, right? I'm going to embrace
Mm-hmm.
the discomfort so that I can do this verb
Yeah.
and find myself intentionally grieving and going through the whole process.
Yeah. And it's that emotional piece of our life. Like we have so many different facets to our life, but that emotional piece, like if we don't handle it or don't deal with it or don't acknowledge it, it's going to seep into every other aspect of our life. And then we definitely can't control it. So you're better off to kind of take some time and be intentional with that. And I think that that's like that intentionality. I always think of that word as like it's a choice.
Hmm.
Like you're choosing to do something, but you can also choose to not do something.
Hmm.
So like avoidance of
Hmm.
grief is
Hmm.
also a choice.
Hmm.
Not a great option.
No,
I don't recommend.
incomplete grief
Mhm.
will show up. Like it's going to come out
Yep.
whether you want it to or not.
Usually
So
the times you don't want it to come out.
absolutely, and that's when you do spontaneously
Mm.
combust. But it will show up in the symptoms, right?
Mm.
It'll show up in anger,
Yeah.
chronic fatigue, substance use or misuse, eating disorders. Like it's going to show up
Mm-hmm.
in so many other
Yeah.
ways, and we're going to tell ourselves it's because of X, Y, and Z,
Mm-hmm.
and totally miss the connection that no, it's because we did not fully complete our grief.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it's such a good point because it's something we have to process through. And even if it's not something you realize that you're grieving, because like
Mm-mm.
there's pieces in our life that there are things that are out of our control, and you don't realize that like you need to take that time to grieve. And like you kind of mentioned a little bit of the warning signs, but what are some warning signs that could kind of alert you to, hey, there might be something you need to process through here, and it would be able to take that first step to recognizing it.
I think one thing that really stands out to me is what we call phantom conversations.
Mm.
If you find yourself like you're driving down the road and you find yourself thinking through or you're having this conversation in your head with maybe someone you've lost either to death or loss of
Mhm.
relationship, and you find yourself like revisiting conversations and
Mm.
thinking about what you would say, and then if they said this and
Yeah.
I would say that, and I should have wish I would have said this or wish
Mhm.
ding 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 ding,
Yeah.
we definitely have
Mm.
that incomplete grief. I
Yeah.
think that's probably one of the most common
Mhm.
signs or symptoms, I guess you would say, of that sense of incomplete
Mm.
grief. A lot of thoughts of "I wish I would have."
Yeah.
Um, Definitely a good sign of because honestly, is there ever a loss where you're like, "Well, it was good timing. I feel like I was done with them." Like that's
No.
never going to happen. I don't
No.
care what it is,
Yeah.
right? There's always a sense of incompleteness.
Mhm.
And so there begins the work of figuring out how to complete it. Like, how do
Yeah.
I get that to a place where I feel like it, okay, I'm done. I found that done place.
Yeah.
And a lot of that has to do with finding that sense of acceptance.
Mm.
And I think that when, again, I find myself sitting across from people, I think it's helpful because I'm not inside their circle,
Mm. Yeah.
and they can cry and they
Mhm.
can say whatever they want and they can keep coming back. We can have the same conversation
Yeah.
3 times in a row. They want to tell me the same story. All right, let's go through it again. The
Yeah.
same story, it is helpful to
Yeah.
find that person outside your circle.
Yeah. I think it's, one of the things we always say is like talk about it,
Mhm.
talking about it, and that the idea you brought up even earlier, just our culture is like suck it up,
Mm.
like get over it, and that's not the best option. It's this it's the stuffing it down piece that we continually do, and I'm guilty of it. Like it's one of those things that we just think we're supposed to do, but it's not healthy, and
Mm-mm.
we have to get it out. And so if you need to find somebody else or a professional that's outside of your circle to talk about it, that can help you gain perspective on it too, because I think that goes into like we can start to take things in our own narratives in our minds with those conversations and
Mm.
everything else, that we will take it down a whole different path. And once it was grief, and now it's
Mm.
grief with all these other pieces
Mhm.
tied to it. So it can really take you down a spiral if you don't acknowledge it and start to walk through that.
Yeah, and I think when you realize that if you'll be intentional
Mhm.
with it, right, that there is an actual end point,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
I will always acknowledge that space is now empty. I will always acknowledge,
Mhm.
right, that is no longer in my current in my present, but there is an end to that grief.
Yeah.
And one of my favorites is in Ecclesiastes 3, that there's a time to weep and a time to
Mhm.
laugh. There's a time to mourn and a time to dance.
Yeah.
There's a time for each of these things.
Yeah.
It's been put in us. And being created in God's image means we have emotions,
Yep.
right? And to emote is very much like a verb, right?
Yep.
Like we do something, we
Yeah.
are expressing
Mhm.
emotions. When God expressed emotions, like that's why
Yeah.
we have them. And they're meant to be like release valves.
Yeah.
That's the whole point. It's not meant to stuff it up. And your level of okayness
Mhm.
is not measured by how much emotion
Mm.
that you let out.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great line. And I think too, because you can come to this end point where you feel you've gotten to a point. That doesn't mean that looks like everything is rainbows
Nope.
afterwards. And I think in our expectations, sometimes we're like, well, I'll feel better when,
Mm.
and we try to create these scenarios. But I think it's that acceptance piece that goes to, well, I can feel better because I'm walking through this or because God's with me. And there's different scenarios, obviously, for each person and how you walk through that and get to that point. But it's not that you hit a certain level and then you're like, okay, everything is great and life is just wonderful. Doesn't
Mhm.
work that way. I
Nope.
wish it did. I wish we had a magic wand where you could be like, "All right, you're great. Good. See you later."
Mhm.
But it doesn't work that way. So we have to take action. And that's where this intentional piece is. I think there's so many aspects of our life that we need to be intentional with. This is one that kind of gets thrown by the wayside a lot. Again, we stuff it down, we push it off to the side. So if someone's listening and they're struggling, like this really relates to them. They're like listening in and they're like, okay, yep, check that box, check that box. Like that's me. I didn't realize I was dealing with it, or I thought I had grieved it already, but I didn't fully. What are some things that people can do? Like obviously we said talk to someone.
Mhm. Mhm.
And that could be someone that you're really trusted close to, or it could be a professional. But what are some other things that people could do to help walk through that grief and through that process?
I think one of the great things that people have done, and it's just really cool to watch it work, is journaling
Mhm.
and getting a grief journal. And usually, I mean, honestly, you can just Google
Yeah.
grief journaling prompts, right?
Yep.
Put that in the Google, hit enter. And there'll be a plethora of
Mhm.
options out there that just get you started,
Yeah.
right? Start with your prompt and just start writing.
Mm.
Finding a place of solitude where you can really go.
Mhm.
And if you haven't wailed yet, you get to wail, right?
Yep.
And you'll know what wailing means, you know.
Mhm.
In the Bible they did things like they threw dirt and ashes on themselves,
Mm.
they tore their clothes, they walked around barefoot, took all their jewelry off, they wailed, you know, like
Yeah.
it's very active, very
Mhm.
physical. Setting aside time, you
Yeah.
know, like I think if I remember right, I think Job's friends actually came and sat with him for like 7 days and seven
Mm.
nights. They weren't always the great with advice, but that was pretty
Right?
cool, right? They
Yeah.
just sat with, and sometimes finding a person who can do that,
Mhm.
who literally can just sit with you. It's not about talking.
Yep.
It's not about trying to make you feel better.
Mhm.
Not about trying to get you to stop crying.
Right.
Sit with and just let you.
Yeah.
And if not, find that quiet space where you can let all of that out. And you might need a little help,
Mhm.
meaning you might need to maybe find a song that will remind you of this
Mhm.
person or this event or whatever, that can help you to be able to tap into
Mhm.
those emotions and let all of that out, kind of turning the faucet on basically.
Yeah, and really sitting in that.
Hmm.
That doesn't sound fun for anyone
Nope.
to go sit in those emotions, but it can be so healthy and so helpful. And then I think the other thing that I think we pull back to a lot is like giving yourself permission
Yep.
to do it,
Hmm.
and being patient with yourself.
Hmm.
Like if it doesn't happen like that
Hmm.
linear, like it doesn't happen here, here, and here, then be patient with that because you're gonna deal with the situation differently than somebody else would. Don't compare yourself to others. All those things that we could say about, I think, every part of our life.
Hmm.
But it's so true. And I think we sometimes need that reminder to continue to be patient with yourself, give yourself grace. And it's okay. Like, it's okay to not be okay, but like, how do we take steps? And that's that active and being intentional
Yeah.
with
And
our
it
grief.
doesn't have to be all day. I'm not
Yeah.
set aside an entire day for
Yeah.
this, but give yourself an hour, 2
Hmm.
hours where there's a beginning and an end time. And I'm
Yeah.
going to go do this. I'm going to intentionally going to allow myself to actively
Hmm.
grieve this, whatever that looks like. And then there's an end time. I think that helps that fear of I'm going to get this thing started and not be able to stop.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. No, I love that. I think those are great tips. Is there anything else you can kind of think of that you want to
I
share?
think I think that's a lot.
Yeah, it is.
Again, it's funny to say that we're excited to talk about grief,
Hmm.
but I think it's so important.
Yep.
Again, because we have the cultural messages that are telling us one thing,
Yep.
that are just not. I just don't think at all that they're in line with what we
Hmm.
learn when we even read the Bible. That
Yeah.
tells us that there is a time to mourn.
Right.
Take time
Yep.
to mourn, and we don't do that
Hmm.
because again, you should just bootstrap it
Yeah.
and move on. And the fact that you're still going to work and you're not crying, that you're laughing, then you're all good. And that's just not the case.
Yeah. So if you're listening to this and that spoke volumes to you, take some of the advice, do some of the things, find somebody to talk to. I say that every time because it's so important.
Mhm.
Getting it out starts to lose that power over you. You're able to start to that process of walking through your emotions and your feelings and really tap into those because that's going to help you along the path and along your journey. And we want you to be in a healthy spot and be able to process through those because there may be a day that you're going to be able to help somebody else
Mhm.
walk through that. And so that's always kind of a thing I like to think through of how can I help others through my own experiences as well. And I think you're the same way, Joni.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, if you guys need to reach out to anybody, if you don't have somebody to connect with, please email me. It's in the show notes. I would love to connect with you. And I can't wait for our next conversation. I know we have a lot lined up, so there will be continual ones coming, but I'm always love sitting down and chatting with you. And I hope you guys love to listen to it. And we'll see you again real soon. Thanks for listening to Real Talk with Megan. Remember, you are not alone. Seeking help is a sign of strength, and taking care of your mental health is just as important as taking care of your physical health. We'll see you next time for more honest conversations.